The wind carried the scent of dust and sage across the Wyoming plains, sweeping over the wide stretch of land that belonged to Eli McAllister. The rancher stood with one boot braced on the corral rail, his weathered hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the late afternoon sun. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, but Eli's thoughts were not on his herd. His gaze lingered down the dirt road that led toward the small town of Red Hollow, and the stagecoach that was due to arrive. For months he had wrestled with a decision, pacing his cabin at night, staring at the empty chair across from him at supper, and listening to the creak of silence in a house that had once rung with his late mother's laughter. A man could work himself to the bone running a ranch, but without companionship, without someone to share the long evenings, the work hollowed out a man from the inside. So, he had done what many lonely men out west had done before him. He'd sent away for a mail-order bride. The letters had been exchanged with a woman named Clara Whitfield, a schoolteacher from Ohio, at least from what the agency claimed. Her words had been polite, even tender, speaking of faith, a longing for a home, and the wish to be a good wife. Eli had read her letters over and over, careful with them as if they were fine glass. And now, today, that promise of a future was finally coming by stagecoach. Eli rubbed the back of his neck, a rare flicker of nerves stirring in his chest. He had pictured Clara as plain but gentle, modest and grateful for the chance at a new life. That was all he wanted: kindness, steadiness, someone who might soften the sharp edges of his solitude. The distant rumble of wheels reached his ears, followed by the rhythmic crack of the driver's whip. Eli straightened, tugging his hat lower, trying to steady himself. He wasn't a man prone to fancies, but something about this moment made his throat dry. The stagecoach rattled into view in a storm of dust, drawn by 4 chestnut horses. It lumbered to a stop in front of the general store, a small crowd gathering. Red Hollow was starved for excitement, and a new bride for a rancher was fine entertainment. Eli walked forward, boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. His heart pounded, not with romance, but with the weight of decision. This was it. The door of the stage swung open, and instead of a modest bonnet-wearing schoolteacher, a tall woman stepped down, the kind that made conversation die in men's throats. Her gown was deep red, trimmed with lace that had seen better days, but it clung to her figure in a way no respectable bride would dare. Her dark hair tumbled loose around her shoulders, gleaming like satin under the sun, and her lips were painted the shade of ripe cherries. She carried no Bible, no hope chest, just a small, battered carpet-bag and a confidence that seemed to challenge every whisper already rising from the crowd. Eli froze. The woman glanced around, her gaze settling on him, sharp and assessing. Then she smiled, slow and practiced. "You must be Mr. McAllister," she drawled, her voice low and husky with a trace of mockery. "Your bride has arrived." A murmur rippled through the onlookers, gossip, shock, maybe even amusement. Eli heard a man chuckle, another hiss to his wife. He felt the eyes of the whole town prick his skin. His jaw tightened. This was wrong. This woman was no schoolteacher from Ohio. "Name," he said, his voice clipped, rough as gravel. The woman tilted her head, eyes glinting. "Rosalie Quinn." The name hit him like a stone. Even Eli, who kept to himself more than most, had heard it. Rosalie Quinn, the saloon girl turned Notorious, whispered about from Deadwood to Cheyenne. Men knew her for the way she could make them forget their troubles for an evening. Women knew her as trouble itself. "What game is this?" Eli asked, his voice low. "No game," Rosalie replied. She dropped her carpet-bag at her feet with a thud. "I was told you sent for a bride. I'm what you got." The crowd snickered louder now. A few women turned away in disgust, muttering about shame and scandal. Eli's hands curled into fists at his sides. Betrayal burned through him, hot and fast. All his plans, all his hopes, crushed under the weight of this woman's arrival. He should have turned his back right there. Sent her back on the stage. But then he caught something in her eyes, something that didn't match the painted lips and bold stance. Beneath the armor of confidence, there flickered a glimmer of weariness. Desperation, even. "Still," he growled, "I asked for Clara Whitfield." "Clara Whitfield doesn't exist," Rosalie said simply. "The agency thought you wouldn't pay for the truth. Men like you never do." The words stung, though Eli didn't fully understand why. Behind him, the whispers grew crueler. "That rancher's a fool. Imagine bringing filth into his home. She won't last a week." Eli's teeth clenched. He hated being made a spectacle. Rosalie bent to pick up her carpet-bag, her movements graceful but heavy with weariness. "If you don't want me, say so. I'll find my own way." The stagecoach was already rumbling off down the road. There would be no ride back for her. Not today. Eli's chest tightened. He should walk away. He should let her face the consequences of her life. But the truth was, a ranch was no place for a woman alone, especially one carrying a reputation like hers. And as much as his pride howled, Eli McAllister wasn't the kind of man who abandoned someone to the wolves. He jerked his head toward his wagon. "Come on," he said gruffly. "We'll talk at the ranch." Rosalie's lips curved, not in victory, but in a quiet, tired sort of relief. She followed him, each step echoing with the beginning of something neither of them had planned. And as Eli helped her onto his wagon, he had the sinking feeling that his life had just grown far more complicated than he ever bargained for. The wagon jolted over a rut in the road, the reins tight in Eli's calloused hands. He kept his eyes on the trail, his jaw locked, and his hat brim pulled low. Beside him, Rosalie Quinn sat silently, her carpet-bag clutched in her lap, her gaze drifting over the endless stretch of plains. The silence between them was thick. Eli wasn't sure which was worse, the murmurs of the townsfolk still echoing in his head, or the awareness of the woman beside him, every detail of her presence gnawing at him. The faint scent of rosewater clung to her, mixed with dust and stagecoach leather. Her gown shimmered faintly when the sun caught it, though it was worn at the edges. He told himself not to notice, but he did. She wasn't the woman he'd written to. She wasn't the future he had been waiting for. Yet here she was, sitting in his wagon as though fate had mocked him straight to his face. "You don't have to glare at me like I'm the devil," Rosalie said finally, breaking the silence. Her tone was light, but beneath it was a rasp of fatigue. "I didn't ask to be sent here." Eli didn't look at her. "Then why come at all?" Rosalie smirked faintly, though her eyes stayed on the horizon. "Because men like you don't leave much choice for women like me." His grip tightened on the reins. "Don't lump me in with your kind of men." Her head tilted toward him, studying him with unsettling sharpness. "My kind of men? You mean the ones who use me and throw me aside? Or the ones who think they're better because they never touched me but still judge me like a hanging jury?" Eli's jaw worked, but he said nothing. She gave a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Face it, McAllister. The whole world already made up its mind about me. And I'm tired of fighting it." The horse's hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the earth. Eli wrestled with the words sitting heavy on his tongue. He wanted to tell her she was trouble, that she'd ruin everything he'd worked for, that she wasn't welcome. But he couldn't shake the memory of the way she'd looked back in town, not just bold and painted, but also tired. Worn thin, like a woman who had been carrying a burden too long. "Finally," he said gruffly, "you'll stay one night. After that, we'll see." Rosalie turned her face away, her expression unreadable. But her fingers eased slightly on the handle of her carpet-bag. The ranch. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was lowering, painting the land in bands of gold and crimson. The McAllister place wasn't fancy, just a two-room cabin, a weathered barn, and fences stretching out to hold the cattle. But it was steady, honest. Every plank of wood had been hammered by Eli's own hand, every field turned by his sweat. Rosalie stepped down from the wagon and let her gaze wander. "So this is your kingdom." Eli ignored her tone, hauling the feed sack from the wagon bed. "It's work, not a kingdom." She trailed her fingers along the railing of the porch, her eyes softer now. "Looks more like a home than anywhere I've ever had." That stopped him for a moment, but he busied himself with unhitching the horses, refusing to answer. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and smoke. The table was neat, the shelves lined with jars and tins, the rifle propped carefully in the corner. Rosalie set her bag down and lowered herself into a chair, her back straight, her hands folded like a woman trying to fit in a place she didn't belong. Eli lit the lantern, the glow softening the edges of the room. He stole a glance at her. Without the town's eyes on them, she seemed different. Not so sharp, not so brazen. Just tired. "Why'd you leave?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. Her eyes flicked to him. "Leave what?" "The life. The saloons. Men." For a long moment she was silent. Then she leaned back in the chair, her gaze fixed on the flickering lantern. "Because I got tired of being somebody else's story. Every man who walked into my room thought he owned a piece of me. And every woman who looked at me saw sin. I figured maybe, just maybe, if I started somewhere new, I could be something different." Eli studied her, his arms crossed. He wanted to scoff, to call it another lie. But there was no performance in her voice this time. Just truth, worn raw. "I didn't expect to end up here," Rosalie added softly. "But I'll make myself useful. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I won't be a burden." Eli let out a slow breath. "We'll see." Supper. She cooked that night, eggs, biscuits, and salted pork. Eli had half expected her to botch it, but the food was good. Better than what he usually managed. She moved in the kitchen like she'd done it before, humming under her breath, her sleeves rolled up, her hair pinned messily at her neck. Eli sat at the table, watching her. The image was disorienting. This woman, the one whispered about in saloons, standing in his kitchen, humming like a housewife. It didn't fit. When she set the plate in front of him, he cleared his throat. "Thank you." Rosalie arched a brow, as though surprised he'd said it. "You're welcome." They ate in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire filling the room. Eli caught himself stealing glances at her, at the way her lashes lowered when she concentrated, at the faint curve of a smile when she tasted her own cooking. She was not at all what he'd wanted. And yet, he shoved the thought aside, hard. After supper, she gathered the dishes. "I'll take the floor. You don't have to worry about me trying to crawl into your bed." Eli's jaw clenched at her bluntness. "The bed's yours. I'll take the floor." She blinked, surprised. Then she gave a soft, almost wistful smile. "That's the first decent thing anyone's done for me in a long time." Eli grunted, grabbed a blanket, and stretched out by the hearth. But long into the night, he lay awake, listening to the sound of Rosalie's breathing in his bed, wondering how long before she slipped away, or worse, slipped past his guard. The town's judgment. The next morning, Eli hitched the wagon to head back into town for supplies. Rosalie insisted on coming, though he warned her it wasn't wise. Sure enough, as soon as they stepped into the mercantile, whispers rose like a swarm of bees. Women turned their backs. Men smirked. The storekeeper's wife looked at Rosalie as if she were filth tracked in on boots. Eli's jaw tightened, but he kept quiet. Rosalie, however, stood tall, her chin lifted. She ignored the stares, her eyes sharp but unreadable. She picked up flour, beans, coffee, handing them to Eli without flinching. When one of the men near the counter muttered, "Guess the rancher didn't care what he bought, long as she was cheap," Eli's blood boiled. He turned sharply, his voice like thunder. "Say that again." The man shrank back, but the smirk never left his face. Eli's fists clenched, but Rosalie touched his arm lightly, shaking her head. "Don't," she whispered. "They're not worth it." He swallowed hard, forced himself to turn away. But the rage simmered. Back in the wagon, Rosalie sat quietly for a while. Then she said softly, "You didn't have to stand up for me." "Yes, I did," Eli muttered. Her eyes searched his face, as though trying to read the truth of him. Then she looked away, her voice almost fragile. "Maybe you're not like all the others after all." That night, back at the ranch, Rosalie mended one of his torn shirts by the firelight. Eli sat across from her, pretending to read the newspaper but really just watching the delicate movement of her hands. She belonged nowhere, and yet, she looked strangely right in his cabin. Too right. Eli forced himself to fold the paper and rise. "Long day tomorrow," he muttered. But as he lay on the floor, listening to the gentle rhythm of her stitching, Eli realized the truth he didn't want to face. Rosalie Quinn was seeping into the cracks of his life. And whether he liked it or not, she wasn't leaving any time soon. The morning broke crisp and cool, the sky washed clean after a night of rain. Eli swung the barn doors open and inhaled the scent of damp earth and hay. Normally, the rhythm of chores steadied him, feeding cattle, mending fences, checking the horses, but today his chest felt heavy. Rosalie had been on his ranch a week now. A week of meals cooked better than he'd had in years. A week of her laughter filling the cabin when she thought he wasn't listening. A week of her rolling up her sleeves and working alongside him with a determination that shamed many men. But it was also a week of whispers. The townsfolk hadn't forgotten. And neither had Eli. She wasn't the woman he'd sent for. She was still Rosalie Quinn, the notorious saloon girl. And yet, she was no longer just that. Eli shook his head, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't afford to get tangled in this. A rancher lived by reputation as much as hard work. If the town turned against him, buyers would back out, neighbors would withhold help. He couldn't risk it. Still, every time Rosalie smiled at him across the supper table, something in his chest shifted, loosening chains he hadn't realized were there. Trouble comes calling. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge. Dust trailed behind the horse as it galloped down toward the ranch. Eli stepped out onto the porch, hand resting on the butt of his revolver out of habit. Rosalie appeared beside him, shading her eyes with one hand. The rider slowed to a trot as he neared, and Eli's gut clenched. It was a face he recognized from the saloons of Red Hollow. Jack Barrett, a man who drank too much, gambled too hard, and was known for running with trouble. "Afternoon, McAllister," Jack drawled as he reined in. His gaze slid to Rosalie, and his grin widened. "Well, ain't this something? Thought I heard a rumor you'd gone and brought Rosalie Quinn out here. Didn't believe it till now." Rosalie stiffened, her face paling. "Get off my land," Eli said flatly. Jack ignored him, leaning lazily in the saddle. "Rosie, darlin', you didn't tell me you was settlin' down. You and me had some good times back in Cheyenne, didn't we? Remember?" Rosalie's fists clenched at her sides, but her voice stayed steady. "Go home, Jack." Jack chuckled. "What's the matter? Rancher doesn't know the half of what you used to be. You think he'll keep you once he hears the real stories?" Eli's blood roared in his ears. He stepped forward, hand hovering over his gun. "I said, get off the land." Jack's grin faltered. He spat in the dirt, glared once more at Rosalie, then wheeled his horse around and galloped back the way he came, dust rising behind him. Silence hung heavy. Rosalie's shoulders sagged, her breath shaky. Eli turned to her, his voice low. "He telling the truth?" Her eyes lifted to his, haunted. Every word he said could have been. "I'm not going to lie to you, Eli. I've done things I'm not proud of. Things I can't erase." Eli stared at her, torn between fury and something else he couldn't name. Finally, she whispered, "If you want me gone, say it now. I'll pack my bag." Eli's chest ached. He wanted to say yes. Wanted to end it before she unraveled everything he'd built. But instead, what came out was, "You think I don't know what people are saying already? You think I don't hear it every time I walk into town?" Rosalie's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Eli stepped closer, his voice hard but trembling. "What I want to know is if you're done with it. With men like him. With the life. If you're not, then yes, leave. But if you are—" he hesitated, then finished gruffly, "then stay." Tears shimmered in Rosalie's eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. "I've been done for a long time. Just didn't know where to go." Something inside Eli shifted then, deep and unyielding. Standing against the town. The next Sunday, Eli hitched the wagon and, to the shock of half the county, drove Rosalie into town for church. The moment they stepped into the little white chapel, whispers ignited. Women drew their children close, men sneered behind their hymnals. The preacher's eyes widened before he smoothed his face into forced calm. Rosalie's back was straight, but Eli could feel the tremor in her arm where it brushed his. They took a seat near the back. The sermon droned on, heavy with veiled warnings about sin and redemption. Rosalie sat still as stone, her gaze fixed on the floor. When the final hymn ended and the congregation rose, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue approached. Mrs. Dalton, the storekeeper's wife. "Mr. McAllister, she said loudly, her gaze darting to Rosalie. "You're a good man. You don't need to chain yourself to this." The crowd stirred, waiting for Eli's answer. He rose slowly, towering over her. His voice carried steady and strong. "This is Rosalie Quinn. She works harder than most men I know. She keeps my home, she helps my ranch, and she's earned every ounce of respect you'd give any woman here." His eyes swept the room. "And if anyone's got a problem with that, they can keep it to themselves." A hush fell. No one spoke. Rosalie stared at him, stunned. For the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach, her armor cracked, and a single tear slid down her cheek. Eli offered her his arm. She took it. Together, they walked out of the chapel, leaving the whispers behind. A new beginning. That evening, back at the ranch, the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers carried on the breeze. Rosalie stood on the porch, gazing out at the endless land, her hands folded in front of her. Eli joined her, his hat in his hands. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "Why'd you do it? In town. You could have let them drive me out." Eli's jaw tightened. "Because they don't see what I see." She turned, her eyes searching his. "And what do you see?" He hesitated, the words heavy but true. "I see a woman who's been through hell and still stands. I see someone who makes this place feel less empty. I see someone I don't want to lose." Rosalie's breath caught, her lips parting in disbelief. For a moment, she looked like a girl again, not the hardened woman the world had shaped. Slowly, Eli reached for her hand. She let him take it, her fingers trembling in his. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "I'm asking you to stay," he said simply. Her eyes filled again, but this time she didn't hide it. "Then I'll stay." Eli pulled her gently against him, her head resting against his chest. The land stretched wide around them, endless and untamed, but for the first time in years, Eli felt steady, whole. And Rosalie Quinn, the woman no one wanted, the woman the world called Notorious, had finally found the one place where she belonged.